Hi everyone, welcome to the fourth and final day of Vidhi's Constitution Open House on taking the Constitution to the people. My name is Rahul Bajaj. I'm a senior resident fellow at the center and will be moderating the panel discussion later today, which will form the final agenda item of this 4-day open house. I hope you have enjoyed the conversations that we have been able to put together so far. Today we have two exciting agenda items. First is a conversation between Rahela and who's a senior resident fellow and leads the Vidhi Maharashtra, who will be speaking with Padmini Baruah, who's a Samvidhaan fellow. As some of you would know, the Samvidhaan fellowships are a set of 6 fellowships that Vidhi started last year in collaboration with the Azim Premji Philanthropic Initiative to generate greater awareness and foster dialogue on the Constitution. Padmini's project is on foreigners' tribunals in Assam. So Rahela and Padmini will spend the next 45 minutes in conversation with each other about different facets of Padmini's project. Thereafter, I'll be moderating a panel discussion on inclusive governance and accounting for marginalized perspectives. That discussion will feature Sambai Bhagat, Sanjay Jen, Professor Sanjay Jen, and Sasha Stevenson from South Africa. I will introduce them in due course when that discussion starts. With that, I will now hand it over to Rahela to take forward the discussion, to start the discussion with Padmini. Thank you.
Hi everyone, good evening and good morning to Padmini. And thank you everyone for joining us on this final day of our Constitution Open House. We look forward to engaging you in a very fascinating project that Padmini has been working on for some time now and has published several research papers on this topic. And I think it's great that we can discuss something that's so relevant and pertinent to today's to our times today, so relevant to the Constitution, to Republic Day, and to all these contexts. And so, without taking much time from that discussion, I'm gonna quickly ask Padmini to, dive straight in. And my just so that we can to start the conversation and to provide context, I'm gonna ask you, Padmini, first to give everybody context, introduce your project, but also to add the historical context, talk a bit about Assam so that we can, to cater to everybody in the audience, to give everybody some context for your project, and then maybe walk us through briefly your project. So then from there, we can take the discussion forward.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. This is a project that I've been working on even before the Samvidhaan Fellowship sort of came into being. So it's a cause that is very dear to my heart and I think very important especially given the current political climate. So before I dive into the historical context, very briefly, the main thing that I was trying to look at is what is happening between judicial interactions between judges and litigants and lawyers who are all involved in fighting cases to protect their citizenship. So to provide some context here, I think we need to go back in time a little bit and talk about where this story starts, which, as most terrifying stories in India starts with the British, right? So the British colonized Assam in 1826. And from there, they began their extractivist policies, which are present usually in mostly everywhere they go. So they sought to expand an administrative and bureaucratic presence in Assam, but they also sought to figure out ways in which they can extract the maximum amount of resources and land from the state. So you have this surge of economic activity, like there was the discovery of oil, the discovery of coal, tea estates, so on and so forth. And then Assam just becomes this site of extraction, right? So one of the main things that the British did, with the impacts of which we're feeling till this date, is they started encouraging around the early 1900s, the migration of a population of peasants from the East Bengal area, modern day Bangladesh, to kind of move in and settle what the British saw as wasteland. Now, as an aside, cultivation practices of different indigenous communities in Assam are vastly different. So what the British consider wasteland may not necessarily be wasteland, but they really wanted to harness the power of labor in order to extract as much as possible. So the first flows of migration of people who are of Bengali Muslim descent began with the British and have been continuing because of seismic events like the partition and the Bangladesh war over and over again. Now, the Assamese community itself and many other indigenous communities within the state of Assam find themselves in a complicated kind of relationship, because on one hand, you have pretty much strong Assamese hegemony in the Northeast. But when you compare to the rest of India, I don't need to talk about the stepmotherly treatment of the Northeast that has been, analyzed several times. So because of the migration of this peasant class, as well as of a middle class of Bengali bureaucrats, there was this big sort of identity crisis almost that especially Assamese activists and intellectuals have been dealing with from colonial times till now. And the impact of that has been to create this modern day idea of the Bengali Muslim as the outsider. The British are very quick to sort of switch their tactics at any point of time. So while in the beginning they were encouraging this kind of migration, somewhere in the 1930s, you find a lot of references to this invasion of a horde of land-hungry Muslims who are going to take over most of the Assamese population. So that kind of rhetoric started with the British rule. And that's really important to remember, because it has been echoed again and again and again in political circumstances in Assam. So most famously, you have the Assam agitation, which my father participated in, full disclosure, where there was a big move to kind of throw out illegal immigrants. Now, there's no demographic numbers available on what is actually happening with migration on the ground. Different studies have different findings, and the numbers are not really aligned, and nobody's tracking this very well. So as a result of that, you have this really conflicted situation where this one population is being consistently marginalized. And it's safe to say that today, the amount of hatred that exists for this particular community is just astounding. Whenever I have conversations with, anecdotally speaking, I have conversations with my, friends who are Assamese or, distant cousins and so forth. There's this big idea that it's completely acceptable to be racist towards this particular community. And that, I think, that idea and that concept has seeped into our state institutions. So that's what I was hoping to uncover. And that's, I think, sort of where we're at right now. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that as and when we discuss the project. But yeah.
So before maybe we go into the detailing of your project, just something struck me, because you mentioned you was while you speak to friends and family and cousins, and anecdotally, you said you speak to them. So in this context, going into the field and talking to people and making it, more than anecdotal, making it more of a study of, trying to understand what's happening on the ground, that becomes so paramount and so important. And as I understand, you did start your project with that intention. You had a different methodology, a different framework, but then COVID happened. And that kind of brought about a big challenge in being able to access the field in its entirety. And so I just thought that given that we're all still living with and dealing with COVID, I thought it would be relevant to maybe, shed some light or share some of your experiences on what happened, how did your methodology change, how did you adapt to COVID, how did that affect your fieldwork, and also, I think there's some kind of a parallel that we can draw about challenges in accessing the Constitution, challenges in accessing the field, and how kind of COVID has further complicated those things. And I think for all researchers, and if there are any researchers in our audience, I think this is something so important because it doing field work has really the nature of it has completely changed in COVID, and I think your project was also affected by that. So maybe you want to share something from there.
Absolutely. So the first research question I had overall is, how are people, in particular Bengali Muslim women, because I was sort of trying to look at it through a feminist methods lens, how are they interacting with the legal system around citizenship in Assam to protect their rights? So I wanted to examine how people who were facing the deprivation of their citizenship for whatever arbitrary reason, how are they interacting with these quasi-judicial and judicial bodies? What kind of challenges are they facing? How are they navigating their networks to try and fight back against this, against this loss of such a critical right? Because, without the right to citizenship, the right to a constitution doesn't exist. You become stuck in this limbo state. So, coming back to COVID, I found it, of course, at the beginning, I was able to do some interviews on the phone, and I was able to talk to lawyers as well and paralegal volunteers. And sort of I already had my network of people who were working on this issue, because I also have been working on this issue for a while now, both in a pro bono lawyer capacity as well as a researcher capacity. So initially I was able to at least find that the ethics of doing research on the phone seemed better than, traveling during COVID, and that's kind of impossible. And a lot of things came to light, notably that because of COVID, the distinctions between a population that has been deprived of their citizenship and the rest of sort of people who are receiving subsidies or any kind of monetary support from the government, there was a very vast difference, because once you're stripped of your citizenship, you no longer have a ration card, you no longer have access to healthcare, you don't have access to any basic services. Basically, you are just stuck in this limbo. So these are very vulnerable populations that we're talking about. So I really had to be mindful of the ethics of kind of interacting with them, and especially during COVID, it just didn't seem right to pursue my fieldwork. So that, though I did get some pretty great insights even from those pilot findings, and I'm happy to share them if that's something we can do.
Yeah, sure, definitely. If you have them on. Please share them. I mean, this will be.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah. So I interviewed 5 people who were affected by statelessness directly, who were fighting these cases before the Foreigners Tribunal, which, by the way, I have so many opinions on the Foreigners Tribunal that I haven't even gotten into that yet, but I hope we can sort of talk about the functioning and how the logics work and stuff in a little bit. But some of the issues that I identified is that the first thing that happens is in the process is that you either through the election commission or the border police, which is a very predominant presence in Assam, you get a notice saying that you are suspected of being a foreigner, and then you have to fight your case before the Foreigners Tribunal. Now, most of these identifications of people as suspected foreigners is really arbitrary. Technically, the process is supposed to be, and there are forms for it, that you have to go, you have to verify, check the documents, and only then can you come and give a notice to have them litigate in front of the Foreigners Tribunal. However, I scanned several copies of these kind of notices that were being issued by the Election Commission, and they're blank forms, like there's no grounds written. So a lot of times people arbitrarily just out of the blue get identified as a D-voter. So one of my respondents said that that she had voted 3 times in the past and was completely flabbergasted when in 1997 she got identified as a D-voter, which is a category like doubtful voter. And if you're a doubtful voter, you have to then present a very strong case before the Foreigners Tribunal. These tribunals are quasi-judicial bodies, and they don't have a home. They don't have a legislative home. Now, I'm not an expert on general tribunal laws, but in my understanding, no tribunal should exist without a legislative home. And further, Article 323A and B of the Constitution clearly delineate the categories that you can have tribunals for. Foreigners tribunals are not one of them. Second thing, the kind of judges who are populating the foreigners tribunal are selected on an incentive basis almost. So the more number of foreigners you declare, the more number of foreigners you declare, the greater the chances that your contracts will be renewed as members. So they're very invested, and there's clearly executive interference happening in this. So with that background, you can imagine that there's already an existing bias, and that bias kind of manifests when we get into the rulings, and I will get into the rulings later. The other thing that became very clear is that legal assistance is one of the most critical challenges that people face. A lot of times, finding a lawyer itself is hard. Secondly, even if they find lawyers, sometimes they come from like strange networks. So sometimes people will approach family members, and they'll approach somebody who knows a lawyer somewhere. Or this one case, one interview I was doing, the respondent said that the police gave them a phone number for a lawyer after serving the notice, and said that maybe they can call this lawyer to help her out. So it's very bizarre kind of relationships that are more complex than simply cops bad and tribunals evil. There's nuances there. Then the other thing that came out from the interviews was that litigants were feeling significantly intimidated by judges in the courtroom, and judges sometimes take on prosecutor roles. So this one time, the judge interviewed one of my respondents and kept drilling into the question of, how long have you lived in Pakistan? When did you come from Pakistan? So, and when she answered that I've never seen Pakistan, I was born here, there was this like immediate disbelief, and that was completely discounted. And I think on a final note, and I think Rahela, we've spoken about this, like there is a certain way that people are talking and writing about this issue where they present litigants as kind of helpless or powerless or just suffering under a system. Whereas I think that the whole process of putting out your documents, because those are the primary proof that you need to present before tribunal, the amount of energy and effort that people put into documents, and the kind of like resilience that is shown in repeatedly showing up before the court and just not giving up, like that was something that really struck me at the time, when there were strong familial networks that provided support. I'm again not saying that these communities are not suffering and are not discriminated against, but there's more, like that. There's more to the story than that. So that's what I found from the pilot. Now, of course, I couldn't kind of pursue these interviews, though hopefully in the future, maybe I'll get into that. Did I answer your question, or did I go off into an angry rant about foreigners tribunals? I'm not sure.
No, but that was really great, because you, opened up so many other facets, and you shared different things about your experiences in the field. And I'm a person who does a lot of ethnographic work, so I always believe that that's where you actually find what's happening on the ground. But you mentioning the example, like, where the judge tells the person you spoke to that, when did you go to Pakistan, or when did you come from Pakistan? So I wanted to ask you is, did you find similar this text written in the judgments that you studied also, or did you only find it as comments being passed in court? Because then you cannot really find that data till you speak to people. So I was just wondering whether you saw the similar trend in written judgments also passed by these foreigner tribunals.
That's a good question. While obviously not this exact thing, no judge in India or no member of any tribunal is going to put these things down on paper, I think. But what happens is when they're getting cross-examined, like it's very intimidating from the judge, like because this is a judicial officer who carries your fate in their hands. And often they take on the role of the prosecution. So the judge asks a lot of questions in cross-examination.
And do you see a similar trend in the
there is a trend to disbelieve and discount the testimonies or pieces of evidence that people put forward. I in fact have a whole table of the different kind of documents that people present and the grounds that the judges have to eliminate these documents, and they're often really trivial: spelling mistakes, some discrepancy in the date that instead of 1961, they accidentally wrote 1962 and the judges will pounce on that. It's just, a very sort of toxic environment.
And
almost.
anything from that table that was starkly, standing out as someone, what I'm basically a judge being brash about it or writing about it, but not, worrying about the consequences that it's in written text, anything like that, any experiences of that nature.
I think the most thing that blew my mind is one person provided the names of their entire ancestry in the voter lists. So usually to dial back a little bit, voter lists are considered very important proof because you have to trace your ancestry back to 25th March, 1971. That's the cutoff date. And by this cutoff date, I mean anybody who's coming into Assam after 25th March 1971 is going to be considered a foreigner, and that's the law as it stands, or has to prove their citizenship. And one of the things that struck me the most is this person provided around a list of 10 documents, including a birth certificate, which is rare because many people in India don't have birth certificates. I don't think my parents have birth certificates, for instance. But the judge discounted the birth certificate and called it not enough evidence to kind of counterbalance the other kind of minor spelling mistake discrepancies. For example, I think they said that their father's name was, okay, I'm changing the name, Akbar Ali and also Akbar Azad. And because of these changes in the name, they're very quick to throw out all other evidence. In fact, on a astounding note, there's still no guidance on what constitutes proper proof of citizenship in India. At different points of time, the courts have held that passports don't count, birth certificates are not enough on their own, land records are not enough on their own. It becomes this huge challenge.
Yeah, I mean, it gets more and more complicated and bureaucratic. And as we can see, also COVID made that even worse and amplified, your need to be a citizen more so, But you mentioned dealing with in your findings, in your readings, dealing with judicial bias. So is that something that you saw statistically, or you have some data on it, or you want to share any of those statistics with us or findings?
For sure. So what happened is, after I kind of couldn't do the field work that was so important to do, I kind of switched over methodologies and decided to look at it from the other side of the story. So I examined around 1444 judgments, which were given to me by Leah Varghese and Shruti Nayak at Daksh, bless them. And the analysis was done both in terms of statistical findings as well as narrative analysis of what the judges were saying exactly. So there I wanted to see how are different litigants being perceived by judges, and are judges acting as political figures in this, because you have this idea of objective judicial neutrality. So I was kind of trying to dive deep into what was happening, and I found some interesting numbers. So 71% of the cases involved Muslim litigants, and 28% of the litigants were Hindu. I have a small, let me just share my screen. I have a small piece of a small slide. Sorry. Can you all see?
Yeah, I can see. You just want to do a full screen.
Yeah.
Share
Yeah. So these were the judges who were who gave the most number of judgments in that data set of 1444 High Court cases. Incidentally, before I forget, there is no appeal from a foreigners tribunal judgment. There's no appellate body. The only way you can contest this decision is by filing a writ petition before the High Court. And as you can imagine, that is like a daunting task, even for those of us who are lawyers. For people who have no interactions with the law before they get hauled up before the foreigners tribunal, it's an astounding feat that people are filing writ petitions. It's quite it speaks volumes to sort of their fight. So these judges were the ones who gave the most number of decisions. And I think the table speaks for itself. You can see how many of the judges have like a very high rate of denying these writ petitions. And even in the cases where they're allowed, usually it doesn't mean that they reverse the decision. Only in one case out of the 1444 that I analyzed, only in one case did I find that the writ petition said that the judgment of the foreigners tribunal was wrong, and that person was declared a citizen. Only one. Otherwise, what happens is even when they allow the writ petition, they send the case right back to the same tribunal that gave them an adverse order usually. So these are some, astounding statistics there. I wanted to also show that there is a systemic bias against Bengali Muslims. Nobody wants to come outright and say it, but if you look at the numbers of the total cases with Muslim litigants, 2/3 were rejected and 1/3 were sent back to the tribunal, where they're likely going to go through the same process with the same outcome. Whereas for Hindu litigants, 58% were kind of denied. 42% were denied, but 58% were allowed to be sent back. So, and you can see the same thing reflecting for women as well. So these kind of statistics don't, I'm not the kind of person to say statistics don't lie, but if you just look at the numbers, you can clearly see that there is this bias, especially because there's really no proof that people who are of Bengali Muslim ethnicity have all come from Bangladesh. People forget that there are many waves of migration that have happened over the years. So these people are not necessarily illegal immigrants. Of course, it's another question that I don't really believe in the concept of an illegal immigrant. I think people, open borders, all of that. But I think there's clear systemic bias. I can't remember which American Supreme Court justice said this, but basically the argument he made was that at the end of the day, the Constitution is read by judges, and judges are people. Therefore, their own kind of bias stems in. Not to profile or anything, but these surnames are all indigenous Assamese surnames. So I guess kind of when you grow up in an environment where immigrants are so vilified, it's very likely that your bias will come out when you're judging. Not to mention these things have become a national security issue for some reason. And that's the rhetoric that they advance on bias.
Okay, thanks for sharing those very interesting and fascinating statistics, and it provides so much context for all of us to understand the deep issues that this problem brings with it. It's so deep rooted. And before I come to that, I just wanted to make a comment on what you had said. It's really amazing about the filing of writ petitions, and like on one hand, this idea of all these people, litigants, being hapless, and on the other hand, them actually going all the way to file a writ petition, to the High Court, and gathering these documents, dealing with this tribunal, finding lawyers. And like you said, for us lawyers also, like filing a writ petition in the High Court is a tedious task. So it does at some level, talk to how people access the Constitution on a daily basis and how judges read the Constitution, but people also have some interaction with the Constitution kind of on a daily basis. And in this case, they're trying to find their existence through it. They're trying to look for their citizenship through it, and they're really banking on the Constitution in many, many ways. And they're trying their best, to access it in an environment that is really hostile. So I think there is something to think about and say for that in that regard.
No, and it's if you think about this whole process, it's very ridiculous, because the first thing that happens is you kind of randomly identify, maybe on the basis of what they're wearing, the language they're speaking, you identify someone as a foreigner, and then you put them through this legal process from which there's very rarely a good outcome. And then once people lose these cases, you can't deport them, because where will you deport them to? They're not Bangladeshi, and Bangladesh won't accept. Why would they accept, this population that's essentially in Assam? So people go into detention camps, and those have been some of the most kind of traumatic experiences, because detention centers, apart from the big one that's being built in Gwalpara or whatever, detention centers are inside jails. So the people who get arrested for this civil offense, because immigration is not a criminal issue here, end up being housed
in
with
jail.
convicts, in jail. And it's ludicrous. How are you going to imprison an entire population? And where do we go from here? Especially because the NRC hearings are coming up. You have these 1.9 million excluded people there. How are 300 foreigners tribunals going to deal with
manage this?
Yeah, it's madness. Like there's complete chaos right now. So I just hope to shed more light on what's going on, so that people wiser than me can perhaps come up with some solutions.
So in these statistics you showed about judicial bias, other than like in your studying, other than judicial bias, is there any one other thing that you think is most causing an issue in this, or creating a hindrance for people to help them
I have a few things that came out when I was reading all of these high court judgments. So I'm gonna go over it point by point. The first is that judges always have an assumption of deceit. They will use the word projected father, purported mother, alleged sister to refer to the family members in question. So that's already reflective of like where their brain was at, And then they also assume that the litigants are lying about things. So for example, one petitioner made a plea that the counsel that she engaged was not representing her appropriately before the tribunal, and that's why an ex parte order was passed, because she didn't know that she had to go to court. And the court completely said something like, this is a totally false plea, and dismissed it. So they're very deliberately not in touch with people's social realities. Another astounding example that comes to mind is the amount that judges disregard people's day-to-day realities. So in one case, the respondent was ill and didn't make a single appearance, and the judge just ruled against him. In another case, the petitioner explained in their sort of written statement that there was heavy flooding and soil erosion, and so the house got really damaged, and then they had to shift to another residence. And because of floods. And as we all know, Assam is devastated and ravaged by floods every year. So this is a reality that, like any common sense, it's common sense for any Assamese citizen, Assamese person to kind of know that there is this problem. But the judge says that the petitioner failed to establish that there was flooding through documentary evidence, which is what? So they're very kind of not sympathetic to people's realities, especially for women. In cases involving women, it's such a gendered experience because you have to prove your linkage to your father. And when women get married off early in life, they tend to have all their future documents in the name of the husband. Now, even if the husband is a citizen, the person married to the husband, or I should say spouse, is not going to be considered a citizen. So a lot of times women have to go out of their way to get extra documents. Like one document that comes to mind is the Gaon Bura certificate, which is the head of the village issues a certificate saying this person is the child of this citizen. But the crisis that comes out of that is when you have such a document, the court considers it a private document that needs to be proved by bringing the village headman over in front to testify. Now you can imagine that the village headman, who is from the female litigant's natal village, probably doesn't live in the same area as where she lives now after getting married. So just producing that person to give the evidence is a really tedious task, and courts have no understanding of this social reality. So for instance, in one document, they provided 2 exhibits to establish linkage between themselves and their father. And both documents were issued by authorities in Bihar because they were originally in Bihar. But since they couldn't bring the Bihari authorities to testify before the court, all the documents were rendered invalid. So in short and in sum, the court is very invested in keeping proof as ambiguous as possible and using whatever excuses it can find, in my opinion, to delineate people as foreigners. Because, I mean, think about the amount of just social pressure there might be to do this. Think about the contexts that these judges have kind of come from, and the national security rhetoric that surrounds the body of the illegal immigrant. They're going to steal our jobs, usually going to take our land, So it's a space that needs urgent reform, or should I say even revolution, because we have to transform these structures. And
one thing, and I think
sorry, I'm rambling because I'm on a flow because I get so mad when I think about this. One final thing, from the interviews, as I said, access to legal services are challenging. And then for instance, I was talking to a high court lawyer who said that the person who was representing her client in the foreigners tribunal was so bad that they had to name him as an opposite party in the writ petition because he messed up the case. So a lot of times people, their lawyers are not necessarily always acting in their favor, and it's not a fault as much as a serious gap in legal services, legal aid. And I think these are themes that run across different sectors. It's not just about the foreigners. But the council in one case, for instance, assured the petitioner that they had the council assured the petitioner that they had filed this written statement and all the documents were given, but in reality they didn't appear before the tribunal. So when the woman finally presented her case, she said, my lawyer didn't produce the documents, but they're there. But the high court treated that as not enough. And then when she didn't know the dates later to show up before court, so the court just filed an ex parte order. Ex parte orders are the specialty of the foreigners tribunals. They churn out ex parte orders faster than McDonald's churns out burgers.
Okay, I mean, on that note, you see, I mean, obviously there's a huge problem of proper legal aid and lack of access to proper legal services or lawyers. And I mean, I think it's so important that you're talking about these issues on this forum, because I think the more we speak about it, the more we can inform people about what is actually happening through these tribunals and on the ground. And I think that's at least one way to kind of talk about issues related to the constitution, to citizenship, and what is happening in another part of the country that many people have no context or alternate way of even thinking about it, or even actually trying to find that knowledge or gain that knowledge. That you have no way to access that information. And because we're reaching towards the end of our very fascinating discussion, and I have some questions from the audience, so I thought I will just quickly put them out to you.
Sure.
So we have a question from Manish. He says, thanks, Padmini, for the detailed and nuanced explanation of the context. He has two questions for you. The first is, how do the set of people that you're working with in the context of their vulnerability see citizenship and the constitution? And the second question, has the ongoing limbo in the NRC situation and the fact that this whole process was precipitated by the highest constitutional judicial body affected these views? So if you want to answer that.
Affected these what?
These views. That is the question here. Yeah.
As in my views?
I get, I suppose he's asking for your views. That's what I understand from the question.
Okay.
Or you can just answer it in a general context. That's fine.
Would you mind repeating the question? I'm sorry, my internet lagged for a second.
Yeah, I'll give you the first question. And you can maybe just address that. How do the set of people that you are working with in the context of their vulnerability see citizenship and the constitution?
Okay, so I don't have an answer to how they see the constitution, because most people are in situations so precarious where I can go back when I go back to the field and check on this question and get back to you on this properly. But my understanding is that if you are worried about the precarity of your citizenship all the time, and then you can lose that right at any point of time, like the constitutional protections will mean nothing. So for a lot of people, even for people who've been included in the NRC, if they're from the Bengali Muslim community, there's always this kind of fear looming large. And as you can, as many of you remember, I'm sure, there were so many suicides during the NRC verification process. People really struggled to engage with this citizenship question. So I think it's a source of fear, if anything else. And also, what am I trying to say? The fact that legal aid is such a failure in this case, despite, many people, now have gotten into this, you have Parichaya and all of these people who are really trying to raise awareness about this and do something about legal aid. In the absence of an understanding of what's going on in the courtroom, I don't know what the law means in that context. Does the law as a terrain apply even in these situations? So there's questions to think about. I don't think that the law in this case is friendly towards, to say the least, towards those populations that they want to otherize.
And I think there's another question which connects to this. So I'm going to jump to that question from, this is a question from Bani Bedi. And they ask, do you think the Constitution has adequate legal protections against the behavior of the foreign tribunals? And would it be helpful to turn to common law or international principles?
Yeah, so for some reason, international principles have done nothing to move this issue on the ground yet, though so many people have written about it from an international human rights context, because it is a failure of human rights, and it is an example of people being rendered stateless, which is an outcome that I think the global community has been at least trying to prevent in many ways, though, we'll get on the method. I can throw shade on many methods, but I won't do that now. Yeah, I lost my train of thought. Can you please remind me the question?
No, basically, the question is, do you think the Constitution has adequate legal protections against the behavior of foreign tribunals?
The Constitution itself doesn't have citizenship as a category for which you can build a tribunal. The tribunal itself is born from an executive order, not from any overarching law. So many things are wrong with the Foreigners Tribunal. And hopefully in the future, we will see petitions or public interest litigations about this. As things stand now, the political climate against immigration and this rhetoric of national security has taken huge precedence. So if you ask me if I'm optimistic, I would say maybe for the future.
And I think I can fit in one last question. What language are the foreign tribunal proceedings conducted in? So this is an anonymous.
Hey, that's such a good question.
Yeah, I'll just complete the question. I'm curious about the power imbalance if the defendants are mostly Bengali speaking populations. And that will be our last question. It's not you should answer that.
Yeah, it's also not that they're just Bengali speaking, right? There's like class divisions and caste divisions, and the kind of patois that this particular community speaks is very different from like sort of posh Calcutta Bengali. So that's like a huge thing. Yeah, proceedings are usually conducted in English or in Assamese. And so I've written about this in one of the papers I'm working on. So that language barrier is very acute. So you rely so much on your lawyer. That lawyer is so important because basically they know the language of the court. But sadly, we're facing a crisis of legal aid. So there are many wonderful for lawyers that I've met on the ground, and I'm certainly not saying that everyone is terrible.
Okay, so I'm going to have to stop the Q&A there. There are some more questions, and maybe they could reach out to you.
You can email me. Yeah,
you can email Padmini and reach out to them for these questions. And Thank you, Padmini, so much for sharing this really insightful and fascinating work on our platform today, talking about it on through our Constitution Open House. And I think it's such an important and relevant topic on Republic Day, on this day of the Constitution, to kind of talk about, to spread this information far and wide, and to provide so much more context, to so many more people. So thank you so much for being a part of our Constitution Open House, and we hope to have you
I
back for
should
more
thank you and Vidhi.
discussions. Yeah, so we hope to have you back for more discussions in the future. Thanks so much, and back to you, Rahul. Thank you.
Yes, thanks very much, Rahela, and thank you, Padmini, for those insightful observations, which are a cause for despair, but also hopefully will point the way in terms of helping people figure out how they can push back against the problematic state of affairs that your research has brought to light. We will now move on to a discussion on inclusive governance, which is the panel discussion that I am moderating. So I will just lay out initially the broad contours of the discussion that I hope we will be able to have. And then we'll briefly introduce our panelists, and I'll lay out the format of the discussion. And then we can take things from there. Maitri, can you confirm if all panelists have joined?
Yeah, all panelists have joined, Rahul.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So, as I said, the topic that we will be covering is inclusive governance and how we account for marginalized perspectives. Now, when we talk about inclusive governance, I was reading a paper in the run up to this session, preparing for this session by the OECD, which talks about inclusion in two main ways, which is both process-based inclusion and outcome-based inclusion. And I hope we can discuss both of them in the course of this discussion. So process-based inclusion would include things like who counts in the decision-making process, whose voices are counted, but also not just sort of people from marginalized perspectives being able to participate, but also being able to exert meaningful influence in the decision-making process. And outcome-based inclusion refers to the issues around distributive equity, how we distribute social goods like infrastructure, land, education, health, sanitation, and sort of who benefits from inclusion, how and why. These are some questions that we need to interrogate. So in the course of the discussion today, there are really four topics that I hope we will be able to cover. And these are: number one, what do we mean by inclusive governance? Like, what are the main features of inclusive governance? Secondly, identify pathways to make governance more inclusive. Thirdly, how do we measure if governance is in fact inclusive? And then fourthly, what do we do to make things better if we find that it's not as inclusive as we would like it to be? So in order to discuss these questions, we have with us three diverse voices, each of whom is an expert in their own right to speak on the subject, and I'm going to just briefly introduce them now. First, we have Sasha Stevenson, who's joining us all the way from South Africa. She is the head of health at Section 27, which is a human rights organization in South Africa. And Sasha studied law at Rhodes University in South Africa. And her in her career began with pursuing an articleship, as part of which she conducted research for former South African Chief Justice Pius Lanka. She also served as a researcher at the International Criminal Court, of the trial chamber of the International Criminal Court. She pursued her master's in law education from the University of Cambridge. And we'll be hearing from her on the first topic of what do we mean for governance to be inclusive. Our second panelist is Sambai Bhagat. Sambhaji is a well-known Dalit activist and poet, playwright, and Lok Shahid and balleteer. And his most famous contribution, perhaps, although he has contributed in a number of ways over the years in influencing Dalit thought and in taking forward the Ambedkarite movement, one of the main contributions was as the music director of Narayan Tamhane's movie Court, which some of you will have seen. And Namaskar Sambhaji Bhai. And third, we have Professor Sanjay Jen, who's the principal of acting principal of ILS Law College, Pune, and is an associate professor there. He teaches constitutional law, jurisprudence, international law, amongst other areas of law. His doctorate was on a feminist reading of the judicial approach to laws on the protection of women in India. Professor Jain combines, like, in terms of the topic at hand, brings to the table both his lived experience as well as his academic expertise on the matter. And he has been teaching at ILS Law College since 2008. He was most famously also awarded by the President of India, APJ Abdul Kalam, an award for being the best employee with a disability. These are national awards that the government gives to disabled people on 3rd December each year. So with those sort of housekeeping points out of the way, I'll now hand it. Yeah, one last thing I'll say before handing it over to Sasha. Just in terms of the format of the discussion, each of our panelists will speak for roughly about 7 minutes initially. After which I will be asking them questions, 2 rounds of questions, I think, realistically. And then we will reserve the last 15 minutes or so for audience Q&A. So with that, I'll hand it over to, and yeah, one other thing I will say, sorry for making too many housekeeping announcements, is kindly speak a little bit slowly so that our sign language interpreters who joined us today can follow along and effectively interpret what you are saying. So just be mindful of that, please. Thank you. So with that, I will hand it over to Sasha to take it from here.
Thanks so much, Rahul, and thanks to everyone. It's really such an honor to be part of this open house and to join you all from South Africa. So as was mentioned, I was asked to talk about what is inclusive governance and what are the components of inclusive governance. And as has been mentioned, there are 2 broad components, I suppose. And the first is about process. It's what does inclusive governance mean for the process of decision making? How are decisions made? Who's included in those decisions? How are they included? And why are they included, quite importantly? And the second is about outcomes. How are resources distributed when decisions are made? How are they distributed and why are they distributed? And what we know is that there is overwhelming evidence that more inclusion makes for better decisions. Decisions that are more effective and that are more resilient. And that inclusive governance is important in and of itself because of both what it indicates and because of what it both indicates and what it establishes in terms of shared values and identities. But we also know that an inclusive process does not necessarily result in an inclusive outcome. And so we need to make sure that we get both right. And perhaps the biggest hurdle for many countries, including my own, is that inclusive governance depends largely on a capable state. It depends on a state that is able to mediate the competition between different competing groups who are all trying to participate in governance. And as I say, this is an issue that we have had to deal with in South Africa quite a lot. In South Africa, we have quite a lot of formal inclusive governance structures. We're a country of participation, at least in word. We have, for example, the South African National AIDS Council, which is a government, private sector, and civil society structure that's meant to coordinate the response to HIV, TB, and STIs. It's a really important structure. It's very inclusive of multiple sectors. So there are sectors for people living with HIV, for youth, people with disabilities, men, women, the LGBTI community, traditional leaders, and traditional healers. So there are a lot of different groups who are incorporated within this structure and incorporated within its decision making. And so in theory, it's a very inclusive and a structure that could lead to better decisions. But in reality, it's become a bit of a bureaucratic nightmare, as big structures sometimes are. And it's really been the site of significant alleged corruption. There's insufficient mediation between different competing groups within SANAC. And as such, it gets stuck in decision-making and in bureaucratic nightmares. We also have, at a more localized level, clinic committees and hospital boards, which are governance structures that are associated with each health facility in the country. And the structures include both healthcare users and staff and management at the facilities. Now, these structures could be a link between the community served and the facility, and that's how it works when it works. But often they are undercapacitated and under-resourced. We don't invest enough in making sure that people are actually able to participate in these structures. So we put them into the committees, but that's as far as it goes. And as a result, the committees and the people in them are not taken seriously in the system. We saw during COVID the real risk of the principle of inclusive governance being used to prefer some voices over others, as business voices got included within decision-making structures and nobody else did. And I imagine that that's the case in many parts of the world. And so I think what this shows is the need to make inclusive governance structures real for both process and outcomes, and how some apparently inclusive structures can fail to comply with their mandate. So we do a lot in South Africa, we do a lot of advocacy for inclusion at all levels. And we also try and ensure that our own work as human rights activists and litigators is inclusive and directed by affected people. We work closely with social movements like the Treatment Action Campaign, and we make sure that in working together, each side or all sides are knowledgeable and able to interact, and that our clients are able to give us the kind of instructions that as lawyers we need. And that's a really important part of inclusivity when it comes to activism. More broadly, we're working on legal proposals for national health insurance, which is a plan to change the health system in the country to pursue universal health coverage. And while the broad proposal of national health insurance that's coming from government is really good, the governance provisions in the national health insurance bill are truly terrible. And so we're trying to get government to learn from the bad experiences the country has had with the centralization of power and exclusion of affected people, to fix governance structures. And you can imagine this is not easy to do. So in particular, where government's plan is for all funding for all health to go into a single fund whose board, chairperson, and CEO are all appointed by the Minister of Health. We're arguing for a decentralized and inclusive governance structure that includes a transparent appointment process and representation from healthcare service users, civil society, academia, and other groups. We're also arguing that the advisory committees of the fund, all of which kind of amusingly are also appointed by the minister, have reserved representation for particular groups, and that the so-called Stakeholder Advisory Committee, which is the only committee that has civil society and user group representation on it, actually has a defined and significant role. At the moment, it has no role at all. And so we recognize that all of this comes in the context of an incapable and weakened state that's suffering from decades of apartheid, followed more recently by a decade of deep and wide corruption and what we've come to call state capture. And so if we're successful with our advocacy to change the governance structures in our health system, we are going to need to do a lot more work. We're going to need to ensure that those who are appointed as representatives within an inclusive governance structure in fact do represent health users or civil society or whatever group that they're trying to represent, and that they are held to account by their sectors. We need to make sure that people who go into these structures are capacitated and supported, and that they in fact wield power within the structures. We need to work to overcome some of the limitations of inclusive governance that we've seen in the past, like over-bureaucratization and delays and improper representation and uneven power relations, and lack of capacity, so that we can benefit from the clear advantages in the process and outcomes that come from including people who are affected by the decisions that affect them. Thanks, Rahul.
Thanks very much, Sasha. There's a lot in there that I think that I found particularly insightful. And I was just thinking to all the contexts in which what you said in the South African context is transferable in India also, in terms of having adequate capacity, institutional capacity, cross-organizational coordination, and ensuring that there's meaningful representation, not just tokenistic, sort of symbolic representation. Now we will hear from Sambhaji, who will talk about how we can ensure that governance is truly inclusive. And Sambhaji will be talking to us in Hindi, English, and Marathi, a little bit of Marathi also. I think if he would like to play some of his music to us, that's something I'm looking forward to if we are able to hear some of that. But after he's done, I will just briefly summarize what he's saying for the benefit of others, like if like Sasha and others who may not be able to understand the parts that are not in English. So Sambhaji, over to you now.
अब दोस्तों, मेरे भाई और बहनों, जो लोग इस डिस्कशन में पार्टिसिपेट हुए हैं उनका मैं स्वागत करता हूं, और एक बहुत ही अच्छा डिस्कशन का मैं भाग हूं, इसके लिए मुझे भी बहुत बढ़िया अच्छा लग रहा है। एक तो अपना जो देश है, हमारा इंडिया है, ये करीबन 5000 साल से एक कास्ट सोसाइटी, पहले तो वर्ण का सोसाइटी था, उसके बाद में 1500 साल से हम लोग एक कास्ट सोसाइटी है। यहाँ जो तरीका है शासन करने का तरीका और शोषण करने का तरीका, इसका मेन जो मीडियम है वो है कास्ट। एक कास्ट बेस्ड सोसाइटी है, तो इसमें लोगों को कौन लोग डिसीजन लेते हैं कि ये देश कैसा चलना चाहिए, ये समाज कैसा चलना चाहिए, इसका निर्णय करने वाले लोग जो है, आप इंडिया का कौन सा भी गांव देखो, एक तो ये तो बस्तियां हैं, गांव के बाहर है, सब दलित है और आदिवासी है और खास करके वीमेन्स है जो घर के अंदर बंद है। मतलब वो है अपर कास्ट भी वुमन है, लेकिन वो घर के अंदर बंद है, तो उनका भी दे आर इक्वलेंट टू दलित्स ओनली, में अनटचेबल है, उनका भी परिस्थिति वैसा ही है। तो किनके हाथ में ये डिसीजन मेकिंग पावर है? तो डिसीजन मेकिंग पावर ऑलवेज इस देश में जो अपर कास्ट है उनके हाथ में रहा है। ये अपर कास्ट के हाथ में क्यों है? क्योंकि उसका दूसरा भाग है कि जो संपत्ति है इस देश का, अगर एक ट्रायंगल बनाए कास्ट का जो लैडर है उसका, और जो हमारे देश में जो जमीन है, जो भी जायदाद है, जो भी संसाधन है, उसका एक उल्टा अगर ट्रायंगल बनाए, तो वे दोनों ट्रायंगल अगर साथ में रखे, तो जिनकी संख्या बहुत कम है लेकिन अपर कास्ट है, ऊपर के साइड में बहुत कम लोग हैं, वो लोगों के पास में सबसे ज्यादा ये जमीन है, वाटर है, एजुकेशन है, मतलब जो भी जरिया है इस देश को रूल करने का, जो भी हथियार है, वो सब उसके हाथ में है, उनके हाथ में है। और जैसे जैसे हम लोग नीचे आते हैं, क्षत्रिया, शूद्रा, अतिशूद्रा, औरतों के नाम के ऊपर तो जमीन जायदाद कुछ भी नहीं था। ये हिंदू कोड बिल डॉक्टर बाबा साहब अम्बेडकर ने लाया था, वो भी तो फेल हो गया। लेकिन औरतों को रियल मायने में आफ्टर अम्बेडकर ये आवाज, ये वॉइस जो है वो मिला, और कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन की वजह से थोड़ा बहुत ये गवर्नेंस में आने का जो रास्ता है वो खुल गया। सेम थिंग इज विद दलित्स। दलित को भी पहले रिजर्वेशन देना पड़ेगा डॉक्टर अम्बेडकर को। राजश्री शाहू महाराज जो थे उन्होंने इसका अपने राज्य में शुरू किया था, उसको 1902 में वो शुरू हो गया था। उसके बाद में डॉक्टर अम्बेडकर ने ये बहुत प्रयास करके जो दबे कुचले हुए जो लोग हैं वो सब लोग मतलब आदिवासी से लेके दलित, ओबीसी, औरतें, इन लोगों को एक उन लोगों ने बहुत प्रार्थना की कि भाई एक अफर्मेटिव एक्शन तो करो अपर कास्ट को। मतलब जैसे कि अमेरिका में एक अफर्मेटिव एक्शन लेते हुए कि जो ब्लैक्स है या जो भी कलर्ड पीपल है इन लोगों को दबाया गया, तो हम वाइट लोग आके हम उनके लिए कुछ करेंगे। तो डॉक्टर अम्बेडकर ने बहुत प्रार्थना की कि भाई ये आप करो, लेकिन ये नहीं किए, तो कानून करके उसको लाना पड़ा। और डॉक्टर अम्बेडकर ने फिर धर्म भी छोड़ दिया कि जिस धर्म के अंदर इंसान को इंसान नहीं कहा जाता वो धर्म में मुझे नहीं रहना है। और कभी धर्मांतर भी किए हमारे बाप दादों ने, वहाँ यहाँ महाराष्ट्र में नागपुर में धर्मांतर किए। तो ये जो जमीन जायदाद और जो फैक्ट्रियां ये जो है, ये जब हम चलाते हैं, हम जो जमीन के ऊपर, जमीन पे आधारित जो लोग हैं, हम लोग एक्चुअल नीचे जो लोग हैं जमीन के ऊपर, वो लोग जब काम करते हैं तो काम के टाइम में तो कास्ट नहीं पूछा जाता है। मैं हमारा एक गाना है कि अभी वो मराठी में है, तो
सुना दीजिए थोड़ा सा।
अरे हाडाची काढ करून काढला खाणीतून कोळसा, खोकून आमचा जीव गेलानी, भरला तुझा खिसा, तवा बदमशा काढला नव्हता का धर्म आमोचा, ओ दादार तवा तू कसं विचारलं नाही की आमची जात कंची आहे, आमचा धर्म कंचा आहे. अरे बांधलं तुझं घर लावूनी इटेवर इट, करून हमाली तुझ्यासाठी रे मोडली आमची पाठ. अभी बहुत बड़ा गाना है, लेकिन इसका मीनिंग में थोड़के में बजाज राहुल जी आपको बताता हूँ कि जब हम काम करते हैं
जी
तो आप कास्ट नहीं पूछते हैं,
हाँ,
लेकिन
हाँ,
देने का टाइम आ जाता है तो आप
अब
बोलते हैं कि
पूछते
आपका
हैं।
जात कौन सा है, आपका धर्म कौन सा है। मतलब जो काम हम लोग करते हैं, हम इस देश के सारे लोगों का डंक उठाते हैं,
हाँ जी,
वो गटर में जाते हैं, मर जाते हैं गटर में गैस की वजह से, तो तभी तो वो बोलते भाई ठीक है जाओ कोई। और वो ऊपर जाके जब हम लोग मतलब कुछ नहीं, एक संरक्षण करके, ये म्युनिसिपालिटी गवर्नमेंट है ना, ये म्युनिसिपालिटी, ये सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट, ये स्टेट गवर्नमेंट, हैंड ग्लोव्स साबन मांगते हैं तो देते नहीं। परमानेंट नौकरी की थी बात छोड़ो। तो इस देश में ये तरीका है एक्सक्लूजन का। अभी इंक्लूजन करने का ट्राई तो किया था, लेकिन जो देश, जो स्टेट है ना, स्टेट कैसा बनता है, तो ये स्टेट ये कास्ट से बनता है। सीधी इंडियन रिपब्लिक इज अ कास्ट रिपब्लिक। ये कास्ट का बन गया है। ये जब कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन बना है तो वो लगा था लोगों को कोई डेमोक्रेटिक होगा, लेकिन ये डेमोक्रेटिक नहीं हुआ, ये कास्ट रिपब्लिक है। ये कास्ट रिपब्लिक की वजह से क्या हो गया है कि भाई जो भी सामान है तो सब तुम्हारे हाथ में है। करीब 50 साल में थोड़ा बहुत कुछ, अभी हमारे जैसा आदमी गटर से उठ के आपके साथ में, बजाज साहब आपके साथ में बात कर सकता है, वो अच्छा नहीं लगता है। तो गांव में अगर कोई इंटरकास्ट मैरिज या कुछ ऐसा कुछ होता है लवाफेर, तो लोगों को काट दिया जाता है, मार दिया जाता है, बहुत खराब तरीके से मार दिया जाता है। तो ये इस देश में स्टेट जो है, जो हेजीमनी है, द हेजीमनी इज अ ब्राह्मणिकल हेजीमनी इन दिस कंट्री. The Brahminical hegemony controls everything. They controls culturally, they controls politically. And वो जो कंट्रोल है, वो कंट्रोल थोड़ा बहुत इधर भी इधर हो गया, थोड़ा वेवरिंग हो गया, तो वो काउंटर रिवोल्यूशन करते हैं। एक छोटा रिवोल्यूशन होता है, जिस तरह से डॉक्टर अंबेडकर हैज गिवन सम गुड थिंग्स टू आवर कंट्री, और उससे कुछ औरतों को और दलितों को कुछ थोड़ा बहुत फायदा हुआ, तो 90s के बाद में ये सब पूरा प्राइवेट किया, ये स्टेट या भी प्राइवेट हो जाएगा ऐसा हमको लगता है, एक एजेंसी करके रह जाएगा। इतने खराब तरीके से प्राइवेटाइज कर रहे कि जहाँ रिजर्वेशन ही नहीं मिल जाए। अभी वो सब पूरा जमीन जुमला और फैक्ट्रियां, ये कारपोरेट सेक्टर किसके हाथ में है, एमएनसीज किसके हाथ में है? कौन से दलित है कि वो एमएनसीज के सीईओ है? कौन है? ये देश का जो सुप्रीम कोर्ट है उधर तो बैठे हुए जो मतलब जो क्या बोलते हैं
जजेस हैं,
जजेस हो, चीफ जस्टिस, वो देखो वो सब कास्ट अपर कास्ट के है। इस देश का मीडिया देखो, मीडिया के पूरे एडिटर है वो लोग अपर कास्ट बैठे हैं। सबसे ज्यादा जमीन वाले लोग वही है, सबसे ज्यादा पैसा वाला भी वही है। वो मतलब पैसा मतलब फैक्ट्रियां जो भी है, मतलब अभी तो साइबर है, साइबर मतलब क्या है, क्या बोलेगा उसको, ये
इंटरनेट।
हाँ इंटरनेट, अभी बराबर, वो नेट पे बैठे हैं भाई, वो जेट पे बैठे हैं भाई, जो नेट पे बैठे हुए जेट पे बैठे हैं क्योंकि वो उनके पास में सब कुछ है ना। तो ये हमारे देश में परिस्थिति है। मुझे लगता है 7 मिनट हो गया क्या, मेरे को समझ में नहीं आता।
हाँ जी नहीं 7-10 होने, हाँ हो गए हैं,
हाँ तो
हो
मेरे
गए।
को अच्छा किया। तो मेरा ये कहना है बेसिकली, अभी जब प्रश्न उत्तर हो जाएगा तो हम ज्यादा बात करेगा।
Hello, good evening. I think Rahul's video has been turned off. So can I invite Mr. Sanjay Jen to please give his comments? Professor Jain, you're on mute.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible now.
Yeah. So first of all, let me congratulate Vidhi for organizing this very important event at a time when we are purporting to celebrate the 75th year of our Azadi, right? I'm using the word purporting to because everybody is under a lot of strain and stress. Or particularly, I'm very pleased to have with us two people from different areas. Sasha from South Africa, who has a legacy of racism and how Mahatma Gandhi fought the war against racism in South Africa. Against that backdrop, on the 75th, on the eve of 75th year of our Azadi, Sasha's presence is more than symbolic. Sambhaji bhai, पहली बार मैंने पैनल में आपके साथ I'm sharing, but I have heard you on television. आपका फिल्म भी देखा है, and I'm mighty pleased to have you and to have having heard you. आपको सुना बहुत अच्छा लगा, बहुत खुशी हुई. Now Rahul asked me to basically speak about two things: how to measure inclusion and diversity, and if there are deficits, how to overcome deficits too, so that inclusion and diversity be promoted. And basically, he asked me to emphasize on inclusion, promotion of diversity and inclusion vis-a-vis marginalized groups. And naturally, when we talk about inclusion or diversity, mostly we are talking about people, sections of society which are marginalized, which are left out. So Rahul rightly set the tone by providing two dimensions of inclusion: process-based inclusion and outcome-based inclusion. And Sasha set the tone. I mean, she took a leaf out of Rahul's page, Rahul's book probably, and went on to demonstrate how, despite process-based inclusion, when it comes to outcomes, often we we fail ourselves. And let me take that discussion forward in terms of then Sambhaji Bhai's comments when he tried to show how we have deteriorated into caste republic rather than a democratic republic. And I remember Dr. Ambedkar's memorable words that this democratic republic may be a dressing on top, right? It may be just like, decorating the salad. But what about inside the salad? What about the rot which is inside the salad? ऊपर से तो बहुत अच्छा दिख रहा है, looking very nice. But what about inside? And then this question, how to then measure, how to find out whether we are really inclusive, how to find out whether we are really promoting diversity. What are the indicators? So there may be different indicators. First of all, what is diversity? Defining diversity itself is very difficult. अखंडता मतलब विभिन्नता मतलब क्या? विभिन्नता का क्या अर्थ है? It is the meaning of diversity. Few people may define diversity in terms of aggregation of different castes coming together, or aggregation of people belonging to different cultures, or aggregation of people belonging to different languages. But such diversity may be a very superficial diversity, but particularly in terms of the topic which I am assigned, because I have to speak about the diversity and inclusion of marginalized sections of the society. So whether marginalized groups, whether they are really people, are they human beings? The discussion starts from, as Sambhaji Bhai very rightly pointed out, in Maharashtra, it is a reality in 21st century that if a Dalit would like to marry and he wants to take a procession of the Dula on horse, he has to take permission from the headman, right? Otherwise, there may be riots. And this has happened in many places. So, at surface level, at process level, if you want to measure the inclusion, you have to put the avenues, whether there are enough avenues for, avenues for exercising one's own rights. At surface level, constitution may give you a lot of rights, laws may give you a lot of rights, but are you in a position to exercise those rights? And if you want to exercise those rights, whether there are rights enabling conditions, because rights without enabling conditions are no rights, they are only empty vessels. So, for example, if it is believed that untouchability is abolished, whether so-called untouchables, quote unquote, can they move freely? Can they move without any restrictions? If there are inhibitions, if there are obstacles in the way of their social mobility, in the way of their economic growth, then can we say confidently that okay, there is diversity or there is inclusion? And diversity not only in terms of caste, diversity is not only in terms of vulnerability, but maybe diversity also in terms of disability. And when it comes to disability, and I would particularly like to invite attention of Sambhaji Bhai here, that when it comes to when it comes to promoting the diversity vis-a-vis disabilities, particularly physical and mental disabilities, even amongst Dalits, there is lack of awareness, because even Dalits may feel that okay, physical and mental disabilities are natural, and therefore let's leave them aside for the time being. So the point which I want to make is this, that are we even clear about the concept of diversity? Because diversity itself is a very difficult concept. Then, let me briefly talk about inclusion. What is inclusion? Inclusion means a behavior which would make you welcome, which would feel that you are welcomed by others. So again, then how to measure inclusion? Whether you are welcomed to take decisions, whether you are welcome to be the part of the processes responsible for laying out policies. Are there instruments like quotas? Are there devices like equal opportunity policies? Are there other social and economic spaces where you can have opportunity to enhance your socio-economic and political mobility, right? For example, take example of panchayats. In panchayats, we talk about reservations, be it SC/ST, be it women. Have we often talked about providing representation to the people with disabilities? And I'm happy that now the process has started in places like Rajasthan, Chhattisgarh. But what about Maharashtra? What about Maharashtra? Have we, my own state, have we ever tried to foster the opportunities for the people with disability so that they may feel that they are politically represented? And represented does not mean somebody would speak on behalf of us. We have to speak on our own behalf, nothing us without us about us, right? So, and then again, in terms of alliances, you can't look at diversity discretely, like, okay, I will talk in terms of disabled, I will talk in terms of Dalits.
Sir, if you could just wrap up in a minute or so, because we are
Quickly.
running behind time,
Yes.
behind schedule.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So instead of having a sporadic or discrete view, right, can we also form alliances? Is there scope for all the various sections of society who are vulnerable? Can they join as alliances? So
Right.
I think these are some of the things which
Right.
thanks again for the
Yes, thanks very much. And I apologize for my poor internet connectivity, because of which I got disconnected between Sambhaji and Professor Jain's interventions. So let me now move on to questions, a set of questions that I wanted to put to our panelists. My first question is for Sasha. So, Sasha, your work involves the role of the use of the law, broadly speaking, in fostering inclusive governance. Now, we all know that the law as an instrument to foster social change, or to fostering, well, not let's keep social change to one side, but the use of the law as an instrument to foster inclusive governance also has its limitations, right? For example, if we look at using the judicial system, which is sort of adversarial case by case litigation, that may not be the best avenue through which to foster systemic change that we need to ensure that governance is in fact truly inclusive. So could you speak to the role of the law in your work in fostering inclusive governance, one, and then two, what other tools do you think can be used to augment the law in fostering inclusive governance?
I mean, I think the first thing is that we can use the law in more ways than just litigation, and use the principles of the Constitution, the jurisprudence that we've got in South Africa. Sorry, I see my internet connection's unstable. I hope that you can still hear me.
I can.
We try and use the jurisprudence that's been developed in South Africa around things like meaningful engagement, which was a principle that was established in relation to housing law, to in advocacy push forward principles of inclusive governance. So I think there are, the law is limited absolutely. But the law is not just litigation, and that there are ways of using constitutional and legal principles to push forward what we want when it comes to inclusive governance. But I think things that the other speakers have said apply here as well. You know, there's a real need for alliances to be formed, for there to be mobilization about these kinds of issues, so that there's a political push as well as a legal one. And it's only through the combination of those tools that we will ever, I think, convince anyone that there needs to be better representation and better inclusion in decision making that affects people.
Right. So then to summarize your response, you're saying one, that the law can be used in more ways than just litigation. Its impact can transcend that, and the principles that the law offers can have wider applicability. And second, it has to be coupled with political mobilization, for one thing, in order to be able to foster more inclusive, in order for us to move towards fostering more inclusive governance.
That was a much better way of saying what I wanted to say. Thanks.
Right, thank you. My now Sambhaji भाई, आपके लिए ये सवाल है कि हम हमारे कंट्री में रिजर्वेशन तो है, एंड वो एक काफी महत्वपूर्ण इंस्ट्रूमेंट है जिसके थ्रू हम कोशिश करते हैं कि जो मार्जिनलाइज्ड बैकग्राउंड से लोग हैं, शेड्यूल कास्ट, शेड्यूल ट्राइब, अदर बैकवर्ड क्लासेस, उनको रिप्रेजेंटेशन मिले पब्लिक सर्विसेज में या एजुकेशनल इंस्टीट्यूशंस में। मगर मेरा सवाल आपके लिए ये है कि ये बात तो आप भी मानेंगे कि रिजर्वेशन खुद ही में काफी नहीं है। लाइक सिर्फ किसी को रिजर्वेशन के बेसिस पे एक पोस्टिंग मिल गई, उससे काम नहीं बनने वाला। दैट हैज टू बी कपल्ड विथ एटीट्यूडनल चेंज एंड मेकिंग श्योर कि जिनको रिजर्वेशन मिल रही है उनको मीनिंगफुल इंक्लूजन भी है उनका, जिस पर्टिकुलर ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में वो हैं। So ये हम कैसे अचीव करें? So just to say in English also, how do we ensure that the grant of reservation or affirmative action is coupled with attitudinal change as well as a push towards meaningful inclusion of those who are the beneficiaries of reservation or affirmative action?
तो बहुत बड़ा प्रोसेस है, और ये मतलब माइंडसेट चेंजिंग जो है ना, मतलब जो एरिया में लोगों को एंट्री नहीं था,
हाँ जी,
तो उसको अगर एंट्री मिल गया तो उधर वो एक मतलब एक्सपीरियंस नहीं, कुछ नहीं है। बहुत पहले से लोग जो गवर्नेंस कर रहे हैं, जिनका मतलब ट्रेडिशन है गवर्नेंस का, तो वो लोग तो उनको क्या है, वो क्लर्क, मतलब जो डॉक्टर अंबेडकर जब पढ़ लिख के आए और बड़ौदा में वो ऑफिसर करके काम करने के लिए गए, तो उनको वो प्यून है, एक कोई प्यून है, वो उसके आंख पे ऊपर फाइल फेंक दिया। तो इंक्लूजन तो क्या, वो राजा ने वो बोला कि भाई आके ऑफिसर करके काम करो। या डॉक्टर अंबेडकर का ही दूसरा उदाहरण, जब वो प्रोफेसर बन गए और एक कॉलेज में पढ़ाने के लिए गए, तो उनके लिए एक अलग वेसल रखा पानी का, तो मतलब, और उनका क्लास में पहला दिन में तो कोई नहीं आया ना। तो ये माइंडसेट चेंजिंग जो है ना, ये बहुत बड़ा मतलब एक कल्चरल रिवोल्यूशन की ये बात है कि एक कल्चरल रिवोल्यूशन होने का जरूरत है। उसके सिवाय डेमोक्रेटिक तरीके से हम जी नहीं सकते। देखो, कल्चरल, ये देश में कल्चरल रिवोल्यूशन होना चाहिए, उसके बाद में ये डेमोक्रेटिक रिवोल्यूशन होगा, फिर डेमोक्रेटिक वैल्यू सिस्टम आएगा। विदाउट डेमोक्रेटिक रिवोल्यूशन और विदाउट cultural revolution in this country, we just cannot expect there will be democratic values। खास करके हम डेमोक्रेटिक वैल्यूज की बात कर रहे हैं कि भाई हम इंसान है, सब लोग एक साथ में रह जाए। लेकिन ये माइंडसेट पुराना है, ये फ्यूडल माइंडसेट है, सेमी फ्यूडल है कई जगह पे। और दूसरे साइड में जो है कि जैसा कि जो दलित लोगों को जिधर भी समझो कुछ मिला है, उधर जाने के लिए भी डेयरिंग नहीं होता है। वो कैसे, मतलब जैसे कि समझो गांव में अभी सरपंच का पद है, तो पहले से जो बैठे हुए लोग हैं, इतने बड़े लोग रहते हैं कि उनके सामने वो खड़ा ही नहीं रह सकता है, या दलित औरत है समझो, जस्ट कैन नॉट स्टैंड, क्योंकि वो लोग 1000 साल
Power
से वही लोग हैं।
dynamics.
तो उनके घर में बर्तन मांजती है और वही सरपंच बन गई, तो उसका क्या होगा? तो ये
जी
बहुत बहुत प्रॉब्लम्स है, इसका माइंडसेट चेंज करना। ये डेमोक्रेसी ऊपर से है,
हाँ
ये
जी
अंदर डेमोक्रेटिक वैल्यू सिस्टम नहीं है हमारे जिंदगी में, हमारे सोसाइटी में। वी
जी
डोंट अबे डेमोक्रेटिक सेटअप को, डेमोक्रेटिक वैल्यूज के साथ में हमारा लाइफ जुड़ता नहीं है। वी आर नॉट कनेक्टेड टू डेमोक्रेटिक वैल्यूज। तो ये
राइट
करने के लिए एक बहुत बड़ा प्रयास करना पड़ेगा, एक बहुत बड़ा रिवोल्यूशन करना पड़ेगा। लेकिन जो भी अभी आपके जैसे लोग हैं, वो एक लेवल पे
जी
डिस्कशन तो नेशनल इंटरनेशनल कर रहे हैं, वो बहुत बढ़िया है।
जी
धन्यवाद।
Okay. Thank you. Professor Jain, my question for you is this, and you sort of spoke to this a little bit in your remarks, but maybe you could build on that in this response. How do we build solidarity across marginalized communities in order to be able to push for inclusive governance? I mean, we need to, the way where I'm coming at it from is in terms of saying that we shouldn't have internal divisions that undermine the strength of the overall movement in the direction of ensuring greater representation of marginalized communities. So how do we make sure that we are able to build synergies and align our strengths as different marginalized groups?
I think your question itself has the answer. You know, we have to synergize by having alliances, but at the same time, while drawing synergy, we have to also ensure that a delicate balance is maintained, so that in the guise of alliances, we don't we are not forced to assimilate, and we are able to also conserve our independent identities. And I think that is where the real problem is. Often, in order to show the bigger picture, we sacrifice the details, and therefore, uh, you know, we always think in terms of big, in terms of huge, in terms of giant, and therefore, okay, we have this alliance, this group, that group, and then we try to congregate people, and in the process, I think we overlook their identities, their original identities. So, for example, if I were to speak of disability as an example, so
Yes.
when you talk about disability, are you talking about all disabilities? And if you're talking about all disabilities, can you really represent all disabilities in terms of one size fits all? So you have to be strategic when you need to congregate and when you need to segregate. Sometimes your responses have to be segregated.
Right.
You need to collect data which is disability desegregated. Sometimes you need a very general data. For example, for voting, you may not require segregated data. But for example, in
Right.
terms of establishing accessibility, you may require segregated data. So this balancing, and just not always look at the things from 20,000 feet scenario. Try to look at things from 1,000 feet scenario also. So that's where I think we make mistakes.
Right.
It's question of having a delicate balance, having synergies, as well as having initiatives to maintain original identities of the various groups.
Right. Right. Okay, thanks very much, Professor Jen. We'll now start taking questions from the audience. So if you do have any questions, please do put them in the Q&A box. Please refrain from putting them in the chat box because it becomes difficult to monitor both simultaneously for me. Until now, I'm only seeing one question. Maitri, do correct me if there are more, but there's one question that I'm seeing from Prashant Padmanabhan, who's asking, Sasha, can you tell us, Sasha, what the process is for the appointment of judges to the South African Supreme Court, by which I think he means the Constitutional Court of South Africa, and how inclusive is that process? And he's asking if you can share any leads in terms of reading more about it.
So we have I think, quite an interesting process for the appointment of judges. It starts with nomination, and judges can be nominated by anybody. So in that way, it's potentially inclusive, although when it's opened up to anyone, obviously it's never completely inclusive. But the first process is nomination, and the nominations then go to the Judicial Service Commission, which is a commission that's set up and contains people from all over. So it contains people from political parties, from legal academia, some from civil society. It is dominated by political parties, though. But it's meant to be quite a broad church of people who receive the nominations and then hold interviews with the people who are nominated. Some people are excluded before interview because they don't meet the requirements. But otherwise, there are interviews that happen, and those interviews are public. So they are streamed online, and there is reporting on them, and so in that way it's quite transparent. The JSC, the Judicial Service Commission, then comes up with a list of shortlisted candidates, and that list must be, I think it's 3 people longer than the number of vacancies at the Constitutional Court. So they come up with a short list of people, which then gets given to the president for the president to select the next justice or justices of the Constitutional Court. So in some ways, it's an process because of the nomination process, and with that, those nominations have to come kind of justification, letters of justification, and then it's a public and open interview process, which sometimes causes some drama and some controversy, as you can imagine. There are obviously some very political questions that get asked, but it's not, as in the US, a very, it's not a politically determined appointment.
Is it very inclusive, would you say, to sort of Prashant's question, would you say that people from marginalized backgrounds do find adequate representation in the judiciary through this process?
No, I don't think that it is sufficiently inclusive. I think in the process of nomination, it is potentially inclusive, but the end result, as is always the case, and particularly in the case of people with disabilities, there isn't a kind of proportional representation of people with disabilities. Interestingly, one of the first justices of the Constitutional Court, Justice Zak Yaqub, was blind. And he's kind of our shining star example, but there are, as is often the case with shining stars, there aren't as many people who've been able to get through the process and follow in his footsteps. And there are quite a small number of people with disabilities in particular who are graduating from our law schools even. So there remains obstacles at every level. In terms of something to read, there was a book maybe 5 or so years ago called The Judiciary in South Africa, which is a book of essays that covers everything. So if you're really into the judiciary in South Africa, that would be the thing to read. Otherwise, there's a really useful website called judgesmatter.co.za. And that's a way for there to be kind of more public engagement with the judicial selection process and what different judges stand for, and the process of their interview and selection. So that might be something else for you to look at, Prashant.
Thank you, Sasha. संभाजी भाई, अगला सवाल आपके लिए है। अभिमन्यु हजारिका ने पूछा है कि आपके भीम आर्मी के बारे में क्या ख्याल है, कि आपको लगता है कि पॉलिटिकल मोबिलाइजेशन के लिए जिस तरीके की वो पूछते हैं कि क्या are the Bhim Army's ways of political mobilization the way forward for Dalit politics for Dalit inclusion in governance according to you? ये पूछा है उन्होंने.
देखिए, ये कोई एक ऑर्गेनाइजेशन ये सवाल छुड़ाने वाला ऐसा नहीं देखा जा सकता है. ये बहुत बड़ा सवाल है और इसके लिए बहुत बड़ा मास मूवमेंट लगेगा. और भीम आर्मी डेफिनेटली कुछ सवाल खड़े कर रहे हैं, कुछ जगह संघर्ष कर रहे हैं, उसका अभिनंदन करना चाहिए. लेकिन ये एक नॉर्थ इंडिया के दायरे में ही काम चल रहा है. मतलब उत्तर भारत का, उत्तर प्रदेश में उसका एक कुछ काम है, रहेगा अलग जगह है, लेकिन खास करके उधर ही दिख रहा है. तो ये ऑल इंडिया फिनोमेना बनना चाहिए. तो उसके लिए तो एक ऑल इंडिया बहुत बड़ा स्ट्रगल जरूरी है. दूसरी चीज है कि ये कास्ट का जो फॉर्म है, द न्यू फॉर्म ऑफ कास्ट ऑपरेशन is evolved with this new economic policy, this new economic world. वर्ल्ड कैपिटलिज्म जो है, नया कैपिटलिज्म जो दुनिया में आया है, उसका कनेक्शन है उसके साथ में. मतलब ये कॉलोनियल कंट्री, सेमी कॉलोनियल कंट्री है. और ये जब तक दलित्स का सवाल, इसको ग्लोबलाइज तरीके से नहीं देखा जाता है. क्योंकि कैसा है सर, राहुल सर, ये सिर्फ अभी देश का सवाल नहीं रहा है. अमेरिका में जाएगा तो उधर भी ग्लोबल इशू बन गया है. तो इसको ग्लोबल कॉन्टेक्स्ट में देखना पड़ेगा. जैसे कि जो डिसेबल या जो लोगों का एक इंटरनेशनली देखना पड़ता है. वो ह्यूमन रेस है, वो ह्यूमन बीइंग्स है, उनको इंटरनेशनल. वैसा अभी कैसा हो गया कि दलित जिधर भी जा रहे हैं, कौन से देश में, उधर कास्टिज्म, मतलब ये जो ब्राह्मणिकल एटीट्यूड के लोग जो है उधर कास्टिज्म कर रहे हैं. अमेरिका में भी कास्टिज्म कर रहे हैं. तो ये ग्लोबल, जैसे हम लोगों का मोबिलिटी बढ़ता है, तो मोबिलिटी के साथ में वो सवाल भी उसके साथ में जाता है. तो ये भीम आर्मी एक प्रयास है. आई रिस्पेक्ट दैट. तो प्रयास को मैं सलाम करता हूँ, लेकिन वो इनफ नहीं है. अलग तरीके से उसको, मतलब जमीन के साथ, जमीन का सवाल और इंपीरियलिज्म का सवाल, इंपीरियलिस्ट जो ताकतें हैं उनका सवाल और जमीन का सवाल, इसको दोनों के साथ में लड़ाई झगड़ा करेंगे तब तक तो नहीं होता. ये सिर्फ स्वाभिमान की लड़ाई, या क्या बोलते हैं उसको, मतलब हमारा आत्मसम्मान के लड़ाई तक हम सीमित नहीं रहना चाहिए. हमारा भौतिक जो सवाल है वो भी सॉल्व होना चाहिए. इसके लिए साम्राज्यवाद के खिलाफ में और इस देश का जो, मतलब जो फ्यूडल, सेमी फ्यूडल स्ट्रक्चर है, उसके खिलाफ में लड़ाई जब तक नहीं छिड़ता है तब तक कोई भी ऑर्गेनाइजेशन इसको कुछ भी नहीं कर सकता है. और ये मास ऑर्गेनाइजेशन, मास मूवमेंट करना पड़ेगा, बड़ा मास मूवमेंट करना पड़ेगा.
Right. So just to summarize, Sambhaji is saying that the Bhim army is a good effort, but it's not sufficient in terms of ensuring adequate political mobilization, both because the challenge is now becoming global, in that the issue of caste is no longer just confined to India, but also because of the capitalism and with economic liberalization, the kinds of challenges that arise when it comes to the oppression of people, of Dalits and other quote unquote backward caste, the kinds of issues that are to be confronted are also different now, which is why we need more innovative thinking and more mobilization. I think we can take one final question because we are almost out of time. So I'm going to take this question. So one question, I don't know if anyone would like to take this, or maybe we can take another one. Subhashish Sarkar is asking, what are some recent initiatives in terms of inclusive governance in India, and what is the future in this field? So does anyone have any thoughts about this, any particular initiative that have recently been undertaken that you would like to flag off?
जो दिया था वो ले लिए वापस. वो क्या करेगा भाई, सरकार ही है. आप सरकार ने पूछा है, जो सरकार जो दिया था वो वापस ले लिया. अभी क्या बोलेगा, वो कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन है, वो जो कुछ अच्छा था उसको अंदर से खत्म कर रहे हैं. तो प्राइवेटाइजेशन करके रिजर्वेशन जो दिया था वो खत्म किया. अभी वो क्या इंक्लूजन करेगा? तो समझना चाहिए सवाल तो बराबर है, पॉजिटिवली देख, बराबर है, वो पॉजिटिवली देख रहे हैं, लेकिन ऐसा कुछ दिख तो नहीं रहा है भाई.
Right. So your thinking, Sambhaji's thinking, is that perhaps we are moving in a backward direction rather than going forward, and especially because of privatization, as a result of which a lot of services and jobs are now at the mercy of the private sector, where reservation policies also do not apply. Which is why, in terms of ensuring inclusion in the workspace, especially in the workplace in particular, there's much more work that needs to be done. एक लास्ट सवाल मैं आपसे पूछ लेता हूँ संभाजी, एंड देन वी कैन एंड, बिकॉज ये काफी इंटरेस्टिंग सवाल है कि हमारे कंट्री में टाइटल्स तो अबॉलिश हो गए हैं कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन जब आया था, मगर उसके बाद भी लोग अपने जो सॉर्ट ऑफ पावरफुल सरनेम्स हैं, फैमिली नेम्स हैं, ये अभी भी चला लेके चलते हैं. लाइक दे हैवंट, वी नॉट डन अवे विद दैट. तो हाउ डू वी मेक श्योर कि ये जो कल्चर है इस तरीके के किसी के फैमिली नेम के बेसिस पे उनको ज्यादा इन्फ्लुएंस देने का, ये हम हटा सकें? एंड आई थिंक इट गोज बैक टू जो आप कास्ट सॉर्ट ऑफ रिपब्लिक वगैरह के बारे में बात कर रहे थे.
ये देखो, सरनेम से ही काम होता. अब मेरा नाम बोल दिया, समझो कामड़े, तो मेरे को कोई सर्टिफिकेट दिखाने की जरूरत नहीं, मैं शेड्यूल कास्ट है, 100% शेड्यूल कास्ट है. और समझो मेरा नाम ले है, साने है, या क्या बापट है, या जो भी है, मतलब अपर कास्ट नेम जो है, नानी से, नेनी से, ले वगैरह, तो उनको कोई सर्टिफिकेट दिखाने का जरूरत नहीं. वो नाम से मालूम पड़ता कि ये ब्राह्मण है. अभी पाटिल, अभी नाम से मालूम पड़ता है ये पाटिल है, बोलेगा तो गांव का पाटिल है, तो ये तो मराठा है मैक्सिमम टाइम्स. हाँ, तो ये नाम से ही मालूम पड़ता. अभी नाम सुतार है तो ये कारपेंटर है करके मालूम ही पड़ता ना. तो ये अबलिश करना चाहिए. इसके लिए माँ बाप का नाम लगाना चाहिए, और ये सरनेम है ना, इसको हटा देना चाहिए. लेकिन कैसा है कि लोग है ना, बजाज जी, जब आप सिर्फ नाम बोलते मेरा नाम संभाजी है, तो अगर किसको मेरा कास्ट निकालने का है ना, वो अंत तक पूछते रहता है कि तुम कहाँ के हो, तुम्हारे क्या माँ का किधर से है, तुम्हारा बाप का गांव किधर है, तुम्हारा भाई किधर रहता है, तुम्हारा ये इधर है क्या, उधर है क्या. और लास्ट में अगर नहीं समझा तो पूछेगा तुम्हारा जात क्या है बताओ. इतना निर्लज रहता है. तो ये नाम का बात नहीं है. एक सच में डेमोक्रेटिक रिवोल्यूशन होना चाहिए, और सच में डेमोक्रेटिक राइट्स मिलना चाहिए. डेमोक्रेटिक वैल्यू सिस्टम को लाना पड़ेगा. ये मास मूवमेंट से करेंगे. इसके लिए एक पहला एक बहुत बड़ा कल्चरल रिवोल्यूशन करना पड़ेगा. ये पॉलिटिकल रिवोल्यूशन बाद में होगा. एक बहुत बड़ा कल्चरल रिवोल्यूशन करना पड़ेगा, ऐसा मेरे को लगता है.
So we need cultural change, and I think that's something that has to start at the individual level, perhaps, in terms of doing away with these entrenched patterns of thinking that perpetuate and reinforce existing societal discrimination. So I think this discussion has been a useful contribution in terms of helping us better understand how we can be more inclusive in our everyday lives, because that is what it boils down to at the end of the day, because those responsible for working our institutions of governance are at the end of the day the same set of people with whom we live in society. So it's an internal process of introspection. It's a process of introspection that I guess we need to prompt, which can in turn translate into changes in systems of governance that help make it more inclusive. I mean, of course, that's not the only thing we need to do. That would be an oversimplification, but that's at least one important takeaway that I'm getting from this conversation. So let me then, on that note, thank our three panelists.
If I were to just add 2 sentences before you wind up. It is important that we have to bring out inclusion, and it should come through cultural revolution. But I think the revolution has to be peaceful.
Yeah. Mass
we
movement.
should, it should be mass movement.
Yeah, I told that.
In the guise of revolution, the kind of movies we are asked to see, and we are given to believe that overnight you will have changes in society.
No, overnight
That's not
change.
going to come.
I'm not talking about overnight change, sir.
Yes, sir. No.
Yes, sir.
I'm not on you, sir. I'm just trying to give like I saw the movie, one movie where a lot of violence was depicted, and at the end the
I don't believe.
revolution was shown. So
I
that's
don't
not the
believe in
solution.
violence. I'm Buddhist.
True, sir. Absolutely.
And you are Jain.
Yes. And that's what going to bring change, non-violence.
Yeah.
Protest.
Yeah. That's true. That's true.
Yeah, so it has to be a thoughtful, peaceful transition in consciousness that can help us move forward. All right, let me on that note thank Sasha, Professor Jen, and Sambhaji for their valuable contributions, to the audience for their interesting questions. It's definitely been an enlightening 1 hour for me, personally speaking, and I hope that you found some inputs, at least something that you take away from this conversation, and not just view it as yet another Zoom webinar that you viewed. So thanks very much. With this, we also come to the end of our Constitution open house. We've been at it for 4 days now, and I hope you found our programming enlightening and engaging. Do continue to stay tuned to our social media channels and our YouTube page to see what other content we come up with in the future. And I hope that all of you will do your bit to ensure that you imbibe the values of the Constitution in your everyday lives, because that's really what it all boils down to at the end of the day. No matter how much high-sounding rhetoric we may hear, or we may try to sort of engage in, at the end of the day, it's about the small little things and making sure that we think about constitutional values on an everyday basis. Okay, with that, it's a wrap. Thanks very much to our sign language interpreters, to Maitri for all the incredible work, not just today, but throughout these 4 days, in terms of putting everything together on the back end. She has been a great source of support, and to all my colleagues at Vidhi who've played a key role in putting together this open house, both in terms of finding speakers, arranging, making sure that all the logistics were in order. I kind of realized, because until now I used to attend Vidhi events, but sort of being at this, on this side of the table, you kind of realize how much work has to go into every single aspect of putting anything of this sort together. So I have acquired a newfound appreciation for those who are able to do this day in and day out. So thanks very much, and good night, and a very happy Republic Day to everyone again.
Okay.